I am standing in my living room, facing a mirror. I am contemplating the direction of modern Hollywood after seeing a brand new film. I slowly and dramatically raise my phone to my eyeline with the hope that all of this is in shot, and stare at the screen. The year is 1989. Playing in cinemas is Batman, this time with Michael Keaton as the Dark Knight. Also still playing is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, a movie that sees the famous archaeologist set off on one final adventure. The year is 2023. Playing in cinemas is The Flash, a movie that features Batman, this time with Michael Keaton as the Dark Knight. Also playing is Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, a movie that sees the famous archaeologist set off on one final adventure. A coincidence not lost on many, that shows that history has a way of repeating itself, especially in Hollywood. I tire of these reboots, these sequels, these remakes. Perhaps it is time for Hollywood to explore originality. Perhaps it is time for them to create something new.
Hugh Jackman's back as Wolverine!
Hello guys and welcome to Rewind Reviews. In this video we're going to be taking a look at one of the most anticipated movies of the year, and that is Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Released in 2023, the fifth and final instalment of the Indiana Jones franchise sees the archaeologist racing against time to retrieve a legendary artifact that can change the course of history. The movie was written and directed by James Mangold alongside co-writers David Koepp, John Henry Butterworth and Jez Butterworth, and stars Harrison Ford, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, Mads Mikkelsen, Ethan Isidore, Boyd Holbrook, Toby Jones, John Rhys Davis, Jeanette Renee Wilson and Antonio Banderas. Indiana Jones is back for one final adventure again, and it is so good to see him. I'll be honest, when it comes to my own experience with this franchise, I only really got into these movies more when I was in my teenage years. I'll be honest, my memory is a little bit fuzzy here, and that's genuinely rare. I'm sure that I saw these movies a lot earlier than I did, because I definitely remember that there are scenes in those movies that I was not allowed to see. If you've seen them, you know exactly which bits I mean. I think the first one that I saw all the way through is either The Last Crusade or Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Anyway, the point is, when I actually did sit down to actually properly watch these movies for the first time, I did finally understand why it was that people do praise these movies as highly as they do. And I will 100% agree that these are some of the best action-adventure movies that have ever been made. But I didn't grow up with them, and I don't have those nostalgic memories that I do with something like Star Wars, for instance. So when they announced that this one was on the way, I'll be honest, I didn't really have strong feelings about it one way or another. I definitely was interested in what direction they were going to take this franchise in, and what it was that they were going to do with Harrison Ford, who at the time that this movie was announced was in his late 70s. But when the trailers started getting released, it did start getting my hopes up a little bit, and it did look like it was going to be a really fun action-packed adventure, and it looked like it was going to stick more to what the tone of the Indiana Jones movies should be, as opposed to the more sci-fi oriented movie that Kingdom of the Crystal Skull ended up being. And before I go any further, I know you guys are going to ask this. I personally don't mind Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I have fun with it overall, and there are some elements that I really do like, but it does have problems. And despite Spielberg and Lucas actually setting it all up during the opening act, the ending really jumped the shark for me with the introduction of aliens. So surely they wouldn't do something as divisive as that in this one, would they? Well, the reaction from both fans and critics was a little bit divisive, and that really didn't ease my mind. And now that I have actually seen the movie, I can understand where they're coming from. But at the same time, and I'm going to be completely honest here, I don't really have strong feelings on this movie one way or another. So just before we jump into this review, I do want to let you guys know that this is going to be a mostly spoiler-free review. I will need to address a few plot points here and there just to get my point across and make sure that you understand where it is that I'm coming from, but apart from that, I am going to be keeping this as spoiler-free as I can. So if you have not seen the movie yet and you want to go into it completely blind, I'd advise seeing the movie before seeing this review. So let's begin. The story for Dial of Destiny sees an older Indy in the 1960s being forced onto one more adventure when his goddaughter Helena comes looking for a mystical artifact that's said to contain special abilities. An artifact which Indy has already dealt with in the past. But hot on her heels are a handful of villains determined to use the artifact's abilities for their own evil ends. So it's pretty standard stuff. This does follow the basic structure of the original Indiana Jones movies, and it mostly sticks fairly close to it with only a few tweaks here and there. So it doesn't really contain any surprises, and I don't think that any of the surprises that they do have are really enough to be much of a shock. Case in point, this movie takes place in the 1960s. More specifically, it actually takes place around the time of the moon landings, but that doesn't factor into the plot in any way at all. Outside of a few costumes and musical choices, there's nothing to really say that this does need to take place in this exact year. It could take place at any point in time and the plot would stay the exact same. I do have a few ideas around what it was that they could have done with this movie, but I do need to openly talk about the direction that they do take in this movie, so I'm going to save all of that for a spoiler talk video, and that's going to be out within the next few days or so. The story is fairly simple, and in fairness, that is in line with the original films, but with the build up to this one, especially with this being the final film, I was expecting something a bit more, especially when it comes to how the plot kicks into gear. When it comes to the performances in this movie, I do think that everyone is pretty good, especially Harrison Ford. As I said, this is an older Indiana Jones whose adventuring days are long behind him, so he does feel different and comes across a bit more of a grumpy old guy, a bit like another Lucasfilm protagonist. But I do think Harrison does well with what he is given, especially in a few of the more emotional scenes where we get to see a different side to him. It's definitely not what I was expecting from him in this movie, especially with his initial reaction to being pursued by these bad guys being to go and contact the police. But it does fit in with this story, and I do think that it is okay overall. But I will admit, it is still pretty cool getting to see Indy still being pretty active in this movie, because it is still a very physically demanding role. And I'll admit, I was curious how they were going to handle all of this with an older character, and they do play into it a little here and there, but they can only believably go so far. I do like what they try to do with him, but I do think that there are a few missed opportunities. One of the biggest ones for me being that he does feel a little bit more like a passive protagonist rather than a more proactive one. So I think one of the changes that I would have made is his reasoning for why he goes after the Dial of Destiny. I think that he should have taken some inspiration from things like Uncharted 4 and have Indy be someone who actually wants to relive the old days and get back out there, especially since he is going to be retiring soon. Give him that chance when Helena shows up and show him actually enjoying himself in one of those kind of I've missed this kind of ways. A bit like what they recently did with Michael Keaton in The Flash. That to me would have been a little bit better, and it would have helped make him a bit more of a proactive protagonist. But that would require a few changes to be made here and there, but I can't really get into that stuff because, well, spoilers. His performance overall is really good, and I do like what it is that they do with him, but for me, I do think that they could have done a little bit more. One of the more divisive elements that is introduced into this movie is Indiana Jones's goddaughter Helena, played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge. I don't mind the character overall, but I can't help but feel a bit mixed about her. She's got her own story in this, and Indiana Jones does get brought into it when she needs help, and I like how there is a history between them, but they don't really dig into it properly, and her story can feel a little bit messy. Plus, how she is with Indiana Jones and how she interacts with him throughout the movie can actually make her a little bit unlikable. It's only later on that this changes and she does improve as a character, but it does take a little while to get there. I get what it is that they are trying to do with her, but willingly putting Indy in harm's way despite knowing how close he was with her father and not having any moments of regret whatsoever or anything, it doesn't help. If you want a character like this done right, I'd say look at how they handled Grace in Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning. That does work, and part of the reason for that is because neither she nor Ethan Hunt know each other. So when she does leave him for dead and runs away when all the bad guys are coming after him, there's absolutely no reason for her to have to stay because there's no connection between them whatsoever. And then through the course of the movie that changes and she becomes a very different character by the end of it, to the point where she does become a part of the team. It does feel very natural, and I do think that the direction that they did go with her character in that movie was really good, and the performance really did help aid that along. Helena in this movie could have been a really great character, and I think there is a lot of potential for what it is that they could do with her as a character, but I just think that they went in the wrong direction with her. The performance from Phoebe Waller-Bridge is fine, and I do like how it is that she is a very active role within this story, but I just don't think that the character works overall. Now, it wouldn't be an Indiana Jones movie without a bad guy, and the main villain in this movie is played by Mads Mikkelsen. Mads Mikkelsen is one of my favourite actors, so seeing he was involved in this was really exciting, and in fairness, I do actually like his character and what it was that they were trying to do with him, especially where they managed to slowly reveal his motivation over the course of the movie, which is a real change of pace for these films. But there's not really that much to him outside of what his goal is, and that kind of goes for the rest of the baddies as well. None of them really stand out from the rest of the usual Indiana Jones villains, especially with this being the third movie all about Indiana Jones taking on Nazis. And people complained that they did that in The Last Crusade. That is apart from one character called Mason, played by Shawnette Renee Wilson. I actually quite liked her character, and I think that the dynamic that she has with the other antagonists is actually interesting. But the issue is that she isn't in the film that much, and I do think that they could have done a lot more with her, especially when she understands who the others are and what they're doing. So for me, this was another wasted opportunity. I think everyone else in this movie is okay overall, but again, there's not an awful lot to them. It's nice seeing Salah again, played by an always reliable John Rhys Davies, and he absolutely should have had a bigger role. Plus, it is always a bonus having Antonio Banderas as well, and he is fun, but he is underused. There's definitely a theme here. Plus, there's the introduction of a new character called Teddy, played by Ethan Isidore. He kind of acts like Helena's version of Short Round, and he does play a small part in the finale, even if it doesn't make 100% sense. But again, he feels underused. In one scene, there is an attempt to give him a little bit more character and a little bit more development, but that's really it. It's just that one scene and then that's it. The performances overall I do think are pretty solid, but when it comes to the actual characters, I think that some of them needed a lot more to do, and then there's others that just feel a little bit unnecessary to the overall plot. If anything, there is one character that I absolutely think they should have brought back into this, but I'll save that for the spoiler talk. I will say it does feel like an Indiana Jones movie overall, but at times it can feel a little bit more like a fan film that happens to have the original cast, and that's weirdly how I felt about seeing the sequel trilogy. It does have the energy of those previous movies, and for the most part it does follow the structure that those movies have, but it does change a few things here and there. So if you are going into this movie expecting an Indiana Jones movie, I would say that it does have a lot of what you would expect from an Indiana Jones movie, but it is a longer film, and I do think that they push the boundaries of what you can really sort of get away with within an Indiana Jones movie. But one of the best parts of this movie is the action. The Indiana Jones movies are absolutely incredible action adventure movies, so I was hoping that the action sequences in this film would be good, and for the most part I would say that they are. I think James Mangold is a fantastic filmmaker, and the action sequences in his movies are usually pretty amazing, so I didn't really have much of a doubt that he could do the same thing here. And as I said, there is a lot of energy, especially in the chase sequences, and they can be pretty fun, but I will say that there is a lack of tension, and there actually isn't that many memorable action sequences. Say what you will about Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and believe me, there's a lot to say, but you do remember those big set pieces. They are handled well in the Dial of Destiny, and they are enjoyable, but the lack of tension stops this from being a proper edge-of-your-seat action movie. That being said, there is one very memorable, very big, and really good action sequence, and that is the opening. The opening sequence for this movie is genuinely great and sees a younger Indiana Jones once again fighting off Nazis in World War II, and it is really a load of fun. It doesn't quite feel as grounded as it probably should. A few scenes are admittedly like this, but there is some really good stunt work here, and how it's all staged is pretty good and actually feels like a classic Indiana Jones film. But I do need to address the de-aging technology that they use to de-age Harrison Ford. Overall, I don't actually think it looks that bad. It looks much better than some other recent films, especially whenever he's in shadow, but it's not perfect and it is noticeable. It's not enough to take you out of the film, but you will watch that scene with the mindset that something is a little bit off. And that's kind of how I feel about most of the CGI in this one. It looks fine overall and it fits what they need to do, but it is obvious whenever CG does take over, which I personally don't really understand, especially since the Indiana Jones movies are far more known for their practical work than the effects or green screen. I know that they did use some effects in the older Indiana Jones movies, and yes, some of them have admittedly aged a little bit, especially some of the green screen sequences in The Last Crusade, but overall a lot of the effects that they do use are as practical as they can be, and they do still hold up really well. I don't see the effects used in this movie holding up anywhere near as well for as long a time as the effects from the first movie. Now, one of the most divisive parts of this movie is the direction that it goes in its final act. I'm not going to go into the details here, but what I will say is that I do understand where a lot of people are coming from. It is an odd decision, and I was really curious when I had seen this movie how people would react to it compared to how they reacted to the aliens in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. It's another one that does lean away from the usual sort of myth and legends that the older Indiana Jones movies are known for, and I'm not really sure how I feel about it. I don't think there's any real setup for what it is that the finale actually does entail, and I feel like how the sequence does play out and how it does end, it does feel a little bit out of place. That's all I'll really say about this sequence in this review. I'll save the rest of that for my spoiler spoiler talk. But as for the stuff that I can say, honestly, this does maintain the sense of adventure, and I do like the locations that they use. Where they go and what they get up to, it does feel like a classic adventure, and we do get to have the traditional follow the red line sequence that charts the journey, which is a really nice touch. And as always, I think that the set design in this movie is actually pretty good. And as for the soundtrack, music maestro John Williams makes his return, and boy is it great hearing that theme again. It is a full-on classic Indiana Jones soundtrack, and the energy that those older soundtracks had is brought back into this. But I will admit, I don't think there's any real standout tracks, especially when I was watching it. It does work overall, and it does fit, and it does suit the tone that this movie has, and it really does help make this feel like an Indiana Jones movie. And I will admit, I do like some of the 60s era music that they do inject into this, like the Beatles and David Bowie. But outside of that, I don't really think that this is a very memorable soundtrack, and I think compared to the soundtracks from the other movies, I do feel like this might be the weakest one. Which is a shame, absolutely, but knowing that John Williams came back to do this soundtrack, and the guy's in his 90s now, I think that that is absolutely fantastic, and I do think that overall it is a pretty solid soundtrack. I will admit though, I do think that this is a soundtrack that is worth listening to all on its own. I would recommend checking out the soundtrack if you can, especially Helena's theme, which is actually a really nice track. So I suppose the real question for this movie is, did I like it? And that's a bit of a complicated answer. There's a lot of good in this, but there's nothing great. I didn't have the highest expectations for this film, but I still couldn't help feel a bit disappointed by many decisions made and the overall direction. It didn't really leave much of an impact on me, and that's most likely the reason why I wasn't in a rush to get this video out as soon as possible, because I really didn't know how to feel about it. It is an okay movie overall, but I don't think this is one that I really want to rewatch. Would I recommend this movie? I would say yes, especially if you are an Indiana Jones fan. I would say check this movie out at least once, but don't go into this with ridiculously high expectations. There is a lot to enjoy, and I do think that the average cinema goer will have a lot of fun with this one. Overall, this movie was okay. It's great seeing Harrison Ford back with a new soundtrack by John Williams. It does have that classic indie feel to it, and I do appreciate that. That being said, there is a lot left to be desired, and despite this having a better conclusion than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, it doesn't feel like this was a necessary movie to make. I will admit I am still very conflicted on this movie, but I did enjoy it enough for what it was. So with all that being said, my rating for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is a 6 out of 10. So that was the final Indiana Jones movie. Again, there is definitely a lot more that I do want to talk about, and I do want to discuss in a little bit more detail, so make sure you keep an eye out for my spoiler talk video if you do want to hear those thoughts. Until then, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy this content, please like, please subscribe, hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that is going on here. If you have seen Dial of Destiny, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Just keep it spoiler free. Plus, if you have any recommendations for any future Rewind reviews you would like me to do, let me know down below. I'm a little behind on my release schedule, but I am planning on reviewing movies like Barbie, Oppenheimer and Ninja Turtles within the next few weeks, so keep an eye out for those videos. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See you guys.